world we live in is obsessed with noise. It thrives on urgency, on movement, on performance. But there are moments, precious, rare moments, when the soul can no longer tolerate the charade, when the masks we wear grow too heavy, when the roles we play no longer feel like us. In those moments, we find ourselves standing on the edge of something we can't name. Not a cliff, not a destination, but a threshold, a space between who we've been and who we're becoming. And it's terrifying, because in that space, everything we thought we knew starts to fall apart. There was a man once who lived a life built on order, structure, control. He was praised for his discipline, for his unwavering ability to show up, deliver, provide. He knew what to expect from his days and what others expected of him. He had carved out a place in the world through sheer will, and yet behind closed doors, he felt empty. Not just tired, empty. Like he was living someone else's life. Like his soul had quietly slipped out the back door while he was too busy answering emails and chasing deadlines. And one day, after years of ignoring the quiet ache, he woke up and couldn't move. Not from illness, from exhaustion, from depletion, from years of silencing his truth in favor of being who the world needed him to be. He lay there, staring at the ceiling as the morning light crawled across the floor and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." That whisper broke something open, not in a violent way, in a sacred way. It was the first honest thing he had said to himself in years. And in that moment, he didn't feel shame. He felt relief, because now finally he could begin again. He stepped away from everything familiar, took time off, closed the laptop, silenced the notifications. He moved to a cabin far away from the city, just him, the woods, and the stillness he had been avoiding for most of his life. The first week was unbearable. His mind raced with questions. What am I doing? What if I'm making a mistake? Who am I without my routines, my titles, my productivity? But slowly the noise began to settle. And beneath the noise, he discovered something ancient, something soft, a voice he hadn't heard since he was a child, his own. Each day he walked into the forest, not to find something, just to be. He noticed the way the light moved through the trees, the way the earth held him without asking for anything in return, the way the birds sang without needing applause. He began to see how life continues even when no one is watching. And it made him wonder, have I spent my whole life performing? He sat by the river and cried, not because something bad had happened, but because something real was waking up inside him. He cried for the boy who once believed he could be anything. He cried for the man who buried that dream beneath expectations. He cried for the years spent chasing approval when all he really wanted was to feel at home in his own skin. And with each tear, he felt lighter. As if grief was not something to be feared, but something to be welcomed. A guest who brings clarity. He began journaling, not to produce, but to process. He wrote letters to the people he never forgave. Letters to the versions of himself he left behind. Letters to the dreams he abandoned. He didn't send them. He didn't need to. The act of writing was enough. And in those pages, he began to find himself. Not the self he was told to be, the self he truly was. Gentle, curious, kind, tired, yes, but still reaching for something more honest. He stopped trying to fix himself, stopped measuring his worth by how much he accomplished in a day. Instead, he began to measure his life by how deeply he felt, how honestly he showed up, how courageously he let go. He learned that healing doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing less, with more presence, from creating space for truth to emerge, from breathing into the discomfort instead of running from it. There were days he still doubted, days when the old voices returned. You're wasting time. This isn't productive. You should be doing more. But now he recognized those voices. They weren't truth, they were trauma. Leftover echoes from a life lived in survival mode. And he didn't try to silence them. He simply said, "Thank you for trying to protect me, but I'm safe now." He began to trust the slowness. He started to see how much he missed by rushing. The smile of a stranger, the way water ripples in sunlight, the texture of bread between his fingers, the way silence hums when you stop trying to fill it. He realized he had been skimming the surface of his life, never fully present for any of it. And now with each moment, he allowed himself to sink deeper. He started cooking meals from scratch, not because he had to, but because it grounded him. He lit candles in the evening, sat by the fire and read old books, not to gain knowledge, but to feel connected to something timeless. He wrote a letter to himself. "You're not late, you're right on time. You don't need to catch up, you need to slow down. You don't need to be perfect. You need to let himself rest, not as a reward for exhaustion, but as a right, as a declaration, I am allowed to be." One morning he woke up before dawn. The world was still, the sky a canvas of fading stars. He stepped outside barefoot, felt the cool earth beneath him, and whispered to the sky, "I'm ready." Not ready for answers, not ready for certainty, but ready to be honest. Ready to live a life that felt like his own, ready to stop performing, ready to start remembering. Oh, be real. You don't need to do more. You need to feel more. You are not broken. You are breaking open. He folded that letter and placed it in a jar by the window, so that every morning, as the light poured in, he would remember. The journey home is not a straight line. It's a spiral, a sacred return. Again and again, to the self you once forgot but never truly lost. And in that remembering, he found peace. Not the kind of peace that depends on everything going right, but the kind that exists beneath it all. A peace that comes from knowing you are allowed to be soft in a world that demands hardness. A peace that says, even now, even here, you are enough. And that was the beginning. The mornings had taken on a new meaning now. Not rushed, not filled with the weight of obligation, but tender. Software. As if each sunrise was offering him another chance to begin again. Not because he had failed, but because life is generous in that way. It never runs out of beginnings. It only waits for us to slow down enough to see them. He no longer jolted awake to the scream of an alarm clock. Instead, his eyes opened gradually with the light, his body aligned with the rhythm of nature, not machines. The air in the cabin was always a little cool in the early hours, a quiet invitation to gather himself before the day started asking anything of him. He had started to notice the smallest things, the way the steam curled from his cup of tea, the tiny creases on his hands, each one holding the memory of something he'd touched, built, held, or let go. The hush of the forest just before dawn, not quite silent, but reverent, as if the world too was pausing to breathe. There was no rush to check his phone, no urgency to respond to messages, no temptation to measure his worth by how early he began working. He was no longer working to earn rest. He was resting to remember his worth. Outside, the trees swayed with the kind of confidence he longed to embody. Not rushed, not self-conscious, but rooted. They didn't try to be taller or lean a certain way. They simply grew. And somehow they were more than enough. He sat with that thought for a long time. What would it mean to live like a tree? To root deeply, to stand tall, to let go when the season changes, to not fear the shedding, the bare branches, the cold, to trust that spring would come again. He smiled at the thought. He was learning to trust his own seasons. There was a day, midweek, when the rain came. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but a gentle drizzle that lasted for hours. He stayed inside, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening. And as he sat by the window, watching the drops race down the glass, he felt something shift in him, a softening, an unraveling, as if the rain wasn't falling outside but within him, cleansing, washing, freeing. He realized how long it had been since he let himself feel safe in stillness. There had always been a part of him that believed quiet meant danger, that stillness was laziness, that if he wasn't moving, achieving, doing, he was failing. But the rain didn't do anything but fall, and still it mattered. It nourished, it healed, and he began to wonder, what if I matter just by being? That question stayed with him. He whispered it to the forest as he walked. He asked it to the sky as the stars blinked overhead. He wrote it on the pages of his journal, over and over. What if I matter, not because of what I do, but because of who I am? And though the answer didn't arrive in words, it came in moments, in the feeling of his own breath, in the silence that didn't judge him, in the warmth of a fire he made just for himself. He was learning a new language, one that didn't need grammar or rules, the language of presence. There were evenings when he'd sit outside long after the sun had gone down, wrapped in silence and stars. Those nights reminded him that there's a kind of clarity that only darkness can bring. When the distractions fall away and you're left with only yourself. At first, that solitude had felt unbearable, but now it felt sacred. There was no longer a rush to fill the quiet. He no longer needed music playing in the background to avoid his thoughts. He could sit and listen, and in listening, he heard things he had missed for years, memories, longings, truths that had been waiting patiently for his attention. He remembered moments from childhood, riding his bike through the neighborhood, the wind in his face, no destination, just movement. Lying on the grass, watching clouds shapeshift into animals, gods, stories. The first time he ever cried because something was beautiful, not because it hurt. Those memories weren't loud or dramatic, but they returned now like old friends, reminding him of who he had always been beneath the noise. He began to see that healing wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering the self he had abandoned along the way. He found an old photograph one day, tucked in a book he had brought with him. It was of him as a teenager, smiling, eyes bright, unaware of the years to come. He stared at it for a long time, not with sadness, but with tenderness. That boy had tried so hard to be good, to be strong, to be enough. He had learned early how to hide his feelings, how to be what others needed, but no one had ever asked him, "What do you need?" And now, as a grown man with gray in his beard and stories in his bones, he whispered it to that photograph. "What did you need back then?" And he listened, and he wrote, and he wept. Not because of the pain, but because of the love he was finally ready to offer himself. The forest taught him how to listen like that, not to fix, not to analyze, just to be present. When he listened to the trees, he didn't expect answers. He expected understanding, and that shift changed everything. He began applying it to his own heart. When sadness came, he didn't try to push it away. He sat with it, offered it tea, asked it gently, "What are you here to show me?" And more often than not, the sadness didn't speak. It simply settled, calmed, dissolved. Because sometimes feelings don't need to be solved. They just need to be seen. He thought often of the people he had loved, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who taught him through their presence, and the ones who taught him through their absence. He stopped labeling those experiences as good or bad. They were just parts of his story. Some chapters hurt, some healed, but all of them mattered. All of them had shaped him into this man sitting by the fire, hands weathered, heart soft, soul awake. He began to forgive, not for their sake, but for his. He forgave himself for staying too long in places that hurt. He forgave the silence that swallowed his truth. He forgave the times he tried to earn love instead of receive it. And in that forgiveness, something old and hard inside him melted. There was a day when he looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. That may seem like nothing, but for him it was everything. For years, his reflection had been a stranger, a project, a problem to fix. But now it was a friend, a witness, a sacred presence. He saw the lines on his face and thanked them. Each one a story, a lesson, a proof that he had lived. He touched his chest, felt the steady thump of his heart, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He had started placing small stones around the cabin, each one marked with a word: breathe, trust, let go, return. They weren't affirmations, they were reminders, anchors. When the old fears crept in, fears of not being enough, fears of being forgotten, he would touch those stones and remember the truth. That worth isn't something you earn, it's something you uncover. And now, even though the world he had left behind was still spinning, still chasing, still screaming, he no longer felt the need to keep up. He had found a different kind of success, one not measured in numbers or praise, but in peace, in presence, in the way he could hold a moment and let it hold him back. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't need them, because finally, after all the years of striving, he had found the one thing he had always been searching for: home. Not in a place, in a feeling, in himself. It was a strange thing, learning how to live without rushing. At first, he didn't know what to do with the empty hours. The day stretched out before him like an open field, wide and without markers. There was no schedule, no urgent list, no reason to check his phone. For someone who had once filled every moment with tasks and obligations, this emptiness felt unnatural, even threatening. He would catch himself reaching for something, anything to fill the silence. But over time, he stopped reaching. He let the stillness stay, and what he once called emptiness began to feel like space. Breathing room, a place where something new could finally grow. That shift didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, like light easing into a dark room. He would find himself sitting longer in the mornings, sipping tea without distraction. He'd walk to the same tree every afternoon, not because it led anywhere, but because it felt like a ritual, a touch point, a quiet tether to the rhythm of the earth. And in these small acts of stillness, he began to hear things he had missed before. The way the birds called to one another, the distant groan of a tree in the wind, the sound of his own breath, steady and alive. He had lived most of his life out of alignment with this rhythm. He had followed a clock that had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with expectation. Wake, work, performance, produce. Rest only when exhausted. And now, without that clock dictating his worth, he was left with something both terrifying and beautiful: choice. He could decide how to spend his time, not out of obligation, but out of desire, out of alignment, out of truth. He began writing again, not for an audience, not for approval, but for himself. His words came slowly at first, hesitant, like they were testing the air. But as he gave them permission to exist without judgment, they flowed more freely. Sometimes they formed stories. Sometimes they poured out as letters to no one. Sometimes they were just fragments, words that felt true even if they didn't form a complete sentence. He realized it didn't matter what the writing became. What mattered was that he was expressing, that he was finally listening to the voice within. One day, as he was writing beneath his favorite tree, a memory surfaced, a moment he hadn't thought of in years. He was 17, standing on a stage in his high school auditorium, reciting a poem he had written for a class assignment. His hands had trembled, his voice had cracked, but when he finished, the room had gone quiet in a way that made him feel deeply seen. That moment had planted something in him, a seed of knowing that his voice mattered, that his truth had a place. But over the years, that seed had been buried beneath practicality, beneath the need to survive. And now, decades later, in the quiet of the forest, that seed was finally sprouting again. He stood up and spoke the words aloud, not the exact poem. He couldn't remember the lines, but the feeling, the raw, unpolished honesty. He spoke to the trees like they were old friends. He spoke to the sky like it was listening. He spoke to himself with a reverence he had once reserved only for others. And when he finished, he laughed, not because it was funny, but because something inside him felt free. He began to understand something that had eluded him for years. The point of life isn't to be impressive, it's to be authentic, to show up as yourself, not as a version crafted for approval, to let people see your cracks, your doubts, your softness, and yes, it's scary. Vulnerability always is, but it's also the only place where real connection can happen. He had spent so much of his life performing strength, but now he was learning the courage of softness, of letting himself be seen without the armor. There were still hard days, days when the old patterns tugged at him, tempting him back into productivity for the sake of validation. He would feel the itch to check his phone, to plan his week, to make a list. But now he noticed the itch, he named it, and most of the time, he didn't scratch it. He let it pass, like a wave, like a memory, like an old friend he no longer needed to follow. He started tending a small garden beside the cabin. It wasn't much, just a few herbs, some wildflowers, a tomato plant. But it became another kind of ritual, another way to be in relationship with life. He marveled at the patience of plants, how they didn't rush their growth, how they trusted the soil, the sun, the seasons. He thought about how often he had tried to force growth in his own life, forcing clarity, forcing healing, forcing success. But now he was learning to trust the organic unfolding of it all. Some days the garden bloomed, some days it didn't. And both were okay. People still came sometimes, wanderers, seekers, strangers who had heard somehow that there was a man in the forest who knew how to listen. They never stayed long, just long enough to sit by the fire, to share a story, to feel seen. He didn't offer advice. He had learned that most people don't need answers. They need presence, someone to hold space while they find their own truth. And so he did. He sat with them. He listened. And when they left, he wished them well, knowing that the journey was theirs alone to walk. One evening, a woman arrived just before sunset. Her eyes were tired in a way that went beyond sleep. She didn't speak for a long time, just sat, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore." The words hit something deep in him. He knew that feeling. He had lived in that ache. He didn't respond with advice. He simply nodded and said, "You're not alone." They sat in silence for a while. Then he handed her a cup of tea and said, "You're not lost. You're just between stories." That phrase, "between stories," lingered in the air like smoke, because that's what it felt like. This space he now inhabited. The in-between, no longer who he had been, not yet who he was becoming. And yet the in-between wasn't empty. It was fertile. It was where the roots grew. It was where the new story gathered breath. He realized that so many people fear this space. The waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing. But now he saw it for what it was. A sacred pause, a holy unfolding. And instead of trying to skip past it, he chose to dwell in it, to trust that the next chapter would arrive when it was ready. And in the meantime, he would keep showing up, to the trees, to the fire, to himself. One night as he lay in bed listening to the rain tap against the roof, he whispered a quiet prayer, not to be saved, not to be changed, but to be remembered by the parts of himself he had forgotten. To be remembered by the earth, by the stars, by the silence that had become his teacher. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt held, not by anyone in particular, but by life itself. The rhythm of life in the forest didn't follow hours or minutes. It followed something older, something more honest. The rustle of leaves, the sudden flight of birds, the hush that fell over everything just before rain. These were the cues he responded to now. They told him when to move, when to rest, when to sit still and listen. His body, once trained to tense at the sound of alarms and buzzing notifications, had softened. He no longer flinched at silence. He welcomed it. And in that silence, he found the pulse of something steady and ancient, not outside of him, but within. Every morning began with breath, not rushed, not shallow, but intentional, a way of greeting the day without expectation. Some mornings he would walk barefoot through the dew-soaked grass, feeling the earth greet him back. There was something sacred about connecting to the ground without shoes, a sense of returning, of remembering that he was part of something larger than his own thoughts. When he stood like that, still, barefoot, open, he didn't feel like a man who had stepped away from society. He felt like a man who had finally stepped into life. There was a tree near the edge of the forest, taller than the others, older too. Its bark was cracked with age, its branches wide like arms in constant prayer. He had taken to visiting it every afternoon, not for answers, but for presence. He'd lean his back against its trunk, close his eyes, and let the hum of the forest settle into his bones. He believed the tree knew things he didn't, not in the way humans think of knowing, but in the way stone knows how to endure and water knows how to flow. One afternoon, as he rested beneath its shade, a question arose, not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper. What have I been avoiding by staying busy? The question startled him, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he had never let himself hear it before. He sat with it for hours, and slowly the answers came, not in sentences, but in sensations. A tightening in his chest, a pang of sadness in his belly, a flush of shame across his face. He was avoiding grief. Grief for the years spent in rooms where he couldn't speak his truth. Grief for the relationships he clung to long after they stopped nurturing him. Grief for the parts of himself he had buried to keep others comfortable. He didn't cry right away. The grief was too old for that, too tired. It sat with him like a companion who didn't need to be comforted, only acknowledged. And so he did. He whispered, "I see you now." And something inside him softened. He began to notice how often people avoid stillness because they fear what it might reveal. They fill the silence with noise, the space with things, the days with movement. Because if they stop, even for a moment, the truth might catch up to them. But here, with no one watching, with nothing to prove, he let the truth arrive. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse. It simply stood there, waiting to be held. He thought of the people he used to surround himself with. So many connections built on mutual pretending. Friendships that thrived only when he stayed small, agreeable, always available. He remembered the times he laughed when he wanted to cry, nodded when he wanted to scream. How many rooms had he entered pretending to be fine? How many conversations had he endured just to keep the peace? And for what? So others wouldn't feel uncomfortable? So he could belong in spaces where he was never truly seen? He let himself grieve those losses, not just of relationships, but of integrity, the ways he had abandoned himself in the name of belonging. And yet, as he sat with that grief, he didn't feel anger. He felt compassion because he understood now. You can't blame someone for not choosing themselves when they were never taught it was an option. He forgave that younger version of himself, the one who made compromises because he was afraid to be alone, the one who stayed silent because speaking would have meant losing everything. He whispered, "You did the best you could, and now we do better." In the evenings, he began lighting a candle before bed, a simple ritual but sacred. The flicker of flame reminded him of impermanence, of light born from surrender. He would sit in its glow and whisper whatever truths needed to be said. Some nights it was gratitude, other nights it was apology. Most nights it was simply, "Thank you, I'm still here." He began writing letters he never sent, to old friends, to lost lovers, to the child he never had, to the parents he never quite understood. These weren't letters of blame or longing. They were offerings, ways of saying, "This happened. I felt this. I needed more. I forgive you." And each letter he burned, watching the smoke rise like prayer, not to erase the past, but to release his grip on it. One particular letter took days to write. It was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. It was a love letter to life, messy, honest, full of contradictions. "I don't always understand you," he wrote. "Sometimes you hurt more than I think I can bear. You take things I thought I needed. You confuse me, break me, humble me. But you also give me mornings like this, quiet moments, the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of tea, the chance to begin again. So even when I don't like you, I still choose you." He didn't know where those words came from, only that they had been waiting a long time to be spoken. Some nights he dreamt of his old life, not as nightmares, but as echoes. He'd see himself sitting in traffic, checking emails, rushing from one obligation to the next. In those dreams, he was always tired, always reaching, always on the edge of something he couldn't name. He'd wake up with his heart racing, the tension of old patterns still clinging to his body, and then he'd step outside, let the cold air touch his skin, and remind himself, "I'm not there anymore." And little by little, the dream would fade, and he'd return to the present. That was the thing about healing. It wasn't linear. It came in waves. Some days he felt weightless. Other days the old fears returned, cloaked in new disguises. But now he had tools: breath, stillness, truth. He no longer ran from the hard days. He met them like weather, inevitable, temporary, cleansing. He thought often of a quote he had once read: "The wound is the place where the light enters you." At the time it had felt poetic. Now it felt true. His wounds weren't proof of failure. They were doorways, invitations to depth, to humility, to connection. And as the days passed, as the forest shifted with the season, he felt something else begin to bloom inside him. Not clarity, not purpose, but presence, a steady hum, a quiet knowing. He didn't need to know what came next. He only needed to be here. And here was enough. The air had begun to change. It carried the scent of something new, subtle and earthy, as if the ground itself was exhaling after a long sleep. The leaves were different colors now, not in a showy, flamboyant way, but like the quiet elegance of someone who has nothing left to prove. The forest had entered a new season, and so had he. He could feel it in the way his body moved more intentionally, in the way his heart didn't flinch at silence the way it used to. He didn't know exactly what had shifted, but something had. He no longer felt like a visitor in his own life. He felt like he had finally come home. This home wasn't made of walls or bricks. It was made of awareness, of honesty, of stillness. It was made of small rituals that grounded him into the present moment. The way he tied his boots before walking the trail, the way he stirred his tea with care, the way he opened the window each morning just to let the air touch his skin. These weren't just actions, they were conversations with the sacred. And in those conversations, he remembered who he was. There were still moments of doubt. Of course there were. Healing doesn't erase doubt. It transforms your relationship with it. Doubt still whispered its old warnings. Are you wasting your life here? Shouldn't you be doing more? But now, instead of arguing with doubt, he welcomed it like an old friend who no longer had power over him. I see you, he'd say. Thank you for your concern. But I'm choosing peace. He had learned that not everything required a response, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Not out of avoidance, but out of trust. Trust that not every battle needs to be fought, not every fire needs to be put out, Some things burn themselves out when you stop feeding them, and some answers arrive only when you stop asking. There was a small pond hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by reeds and wildflowers. He had stumbled upon it one afternoon when he decided to follow a trail he'd never noticed before. It wasn't marked. It wasn't obvious. Just a faint impression in the grass, like someone had walked there once and left an invitation. He followed it, curious, and it led him to the stillest water he had ever seen. So still, in fact, that when he looked into it, he didn't just see his reflection. He saw his truth, not the version of him the world had known, but the version that had always been waiting. He returned to that pond often. It became a kind of mirror, a place to remember. He'd sit for hours watching the way dragonflies skimmed the surface, how the wind barely dared to touch it. It wasn't just water, it was a reminder that peace isn't found in what you achieve, it's found in what you allow. On one visit, he brought a stone. Not just any stone, but one he had found near the cabin the day he first arrived. It had caught his eye then, though he didn't know why. It was smooth, round, with a small crack running through it. He had kept it on the windowsill all this time, like a quiet companion, but now it felt like it needed to return to the earth. So he placed it in the pond, watched the ripples expand outward in perfect circles, and whispered, "Thank you." That small act felt like a ceremony, a letting go. Of what? He couldn't quite say. Perhaps of the past, perhaps of the need to explain everything, perhaps of the idea that growth always has to be visible. Whatever it was, he felt lighter afterward. Not in the dramatic way the world celebrates, but in the gentle way a tree feels when the last leaf falls and it's finally allowed to rest. He had begun to write in the evenings again, but now the words came without urgency. He didn't write to be understood. He wrote to understand. He wrote letters to the moon, to the forest, to versions of himself that still live quietly in the corners of memory. He wrote things he would never publish, things that didn't need to be heard, words that only made sense because they were true. And in those writings, he uncovered a different kind of wisdom, not the kind found in books or lectures, but the kind that rises when you stop trying to be wise, when you stop trying to be anything and simply allow the truth to speak. He remembered something his grandmother once told him. Peace is when your soul stops arguing with your life. He hadn't understood it then, but now it felt like everything. He saw how often he had argued, with reality, with timing, with himself. How many nights he had stayed awake replaying conversations, decisions, regrets. But here, in the softness of a life unhurried, those arguments had quieted, not because he had won, but because he had stopped fighting. There was a moment one morning when a bird landed on the windowsill as he was writing. It was a simple moment, but it filled him with something indescribable. The bird didn't stay long, just enough to be noticed, enough to remind him that presence is a gift, not a demand, that we don't need to hold on to everything. That beauty doesn't need to last forever to be real. He watched the bird fly away and whispered, "Thank you for coming." And then he laughed, not because it was funny, but because his heart was full. That was happening more often now, spontaneous laughter. Not the kind triggered by jokes, but the kind born of alignment, of ease, of deep, inexplicable joy that rises for no reason other than you're finally paying attention. He started speaking aloud to himself, not in madness, but in friendship. "You're okay," he'd say when anxiety crept in. "I love you," he'd whisper when he felt afraid. "I'm proud of you," he'd smile into the mirror, touching his own face like a father would his child. These small affirmations weren't performative. They were reparations, small acts of love for the self he had ignored for too long. And slowly the echoes of old narratives faded. The voice that once told him he had to be more, do more, prove more, had grown quiet. In its place, a new voice had emerged, softer, wiser, patient. It didn't speak often, but when it did, he listened, because it never lied. It said things like, "You're safe now. You've done enough. You are loved." That was the greatest lesson of all. That love doesn't arrive when you fix yourself. It arrives when you meet yourself, as you are, in the mess, in the magic, in the in-between. He no longer saw healing as a destination. He saw it as a relationship, a slow, ongoing reunion with the parts of himself that had been waiting patiently for him to come back. And he had come back, not perfectly, not all at once, but sincerely, one breath at a time. The days had begun to blend together now, not in the way time blurs during routine, but in the way music flows from note to note, distinct yet connected. Each morning was no longer an escape from yesterday, but a continuation of presence. There was a softness to the way time moved here, like the forest itself refused to measure existence by hours. Instead, it measured by sunlight, by shadows, by the way wind arrived without warning and left just as quietly. He had begun to trust this rhythm more than the one he once lived by. That old rhythm had been mechanical, always pushing, always demanding. This new rhythm, organic. There were mornings when he'd wake before the sun and simply lie still, eyes closed, listening, to the quiet creaks of the wooden floorboards, to the deep inhale of trees before dawn, to the soft beat of his own heart. Those moments felt like prayer, not in the religious sense, but in the way a moment becomes holy when you fully inhabit it. He didn't rush to get up. He no longer lived in a world that valued urgency over presence. And in that slowness, he had found something he never knew he was missing: communion. Not with something outside of himself, but with life, with breath, with truth. He remembered a time when waking up meant stress, deadlines, responsibilities. He remembered the pit in his stomach before checking his phone, the way he'd steel himself for what the world would demand of him that day. And now, as he breathed in the scent of morning, earthy, fresh, untouched, he whispered, "I don't ever want to go back." Not because that life was evil or wrong, but because it wasn't his. It was a life shaped by expectation, not intuition. And now he was learning to shape a life that was honest. Each day he carved out a few moments just to sit under the sky, to look up and remember how vast everything was, how small he was in comparison. And instead of that, humbling him into insignificance, it freed him. Because in the grand expanse of stars and galaxies, the pressure to be extraordinary dissolved. He didn't have to change the world. He only had to show up to it with kindness, with truth, with presence. And that, he realized, was more than enough. One afternoon, he found himself kneeling near the garden, his hands buried in soil. The tomatoes were coming in slower than expected. The herbs looked tired, and yet he didn't feel disappointed. He felt grateful, because tending to something without demanding a result had become a form of devotion. He wasn't growing food. He was growing patience, trust. He was learning to love something for what it was, not for what it gave him. And in that lesson, he found a reflection of how he was beginning to love himself. He didn't speak to many people these days, not because he disliked them, but because silence had become his most honest companion. There were no expectations in silence, no need to explain, to convince, to perform. Silence allowed him to feel without the need for words. And in that feeling, he remembered how often he had once spoken just to fill the void. How often he had said yes when he meant no, laughed when he wanted to cry, agreed when he disagreed, just to keep the peace. But peace, he now knew, wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of truth. And truth had begun to live in his body again. Not as an idea, but as a sensation. He could feel when something aligned, when it didn't. He could feel when his body leaned into something and when it recoiled. And slowly he began to trust that feeling more than logic. Not because logic had failed him, but because intuition was speaking in a language deeper than thought. It didn't need to justify itself. It only needed to be honored. One evening, while watching the fire crackle and shift, he remembered a dream he used to have, a dream of standing in a vast desert, nothing around him but sky and sand. In the dream, he always felt afraid at first, alone, exposed. But then, without warning, a door would appear. Just a door, standing upright in the sand. He would open it, and behind it would be nothing. Just more desert. But in the dream, opening the door always brought peace, as if the act of choosing to open something, even if it led nowhere, was enough. He understood now what the dream meant. The door was not an escape, it was an invitation to trust the unknown, to step forward even when you couldn't see what came next, to say yes to life without needing guarantees. He had opened many doors in his life. Some led to pain, others to love, most led to lessons. And now he didn't regret any of them, because each door, each risk, each leap had brought him here. To this version of himself, he could finally look in the mirror and not just tolerate, but respect. He began to move through the cabin with a kind of reverence. Each object had a place. Each gesture had meaning. Washing dishes became meditation. Sweeping the floor became a ritual of clearing not just dust, but energy. Folding blankets became an act of care, not for appearances, but for the soul. He no longer did things just to be done with them. He did them to be with them, to meet life in its simplest, most sacred form. There were times he would catch his reflection in the window, hair longer, face weathered, eyes softer, and feel a swell of emotion, not pride, not nostalgia, something gentler, a kind of quiet reverence for the man he was becoming. Not because he had achieved something grand, but because he had learned how to stay with himself, with the hard days, with the quiet, with the joy. He had learned to stop abandoning himself when things got uncomfortable. And that, he realized, was a kind of success the world rarely applauds, but the soul always recognizes. He often thought about the people who were still running, still chasing, still measuring their worth by how much they produced, how much they pleased, how little they needed. He didn't judge them. He understood them. He had been them. And if they ever found their way to his door, he would greet them not with advice, but with space, with tea, with silence. Because he knew now, healing doesn't happen through instruction. It happens through invitation, through presence, through being with someone exactly where they are, without trying to change them. One night, under a sky thick with stars, he whispered aloud, "I'm proud of you." The words weren't dramatic. There was no audience, just him, the trees, and the wind. But in that moment, the words felt true. For all the times he had kept going when he wanted to give up. For all the moments he had chosen honesty over comfort. For the decision to come here in the first place. To slow down, to unlearn, to remember. He didn't know what tomorrow held. But for the first time in his life, that didn't scare him. Because today, this moment, this breath, was enough, and he was enough. The sound of autumn had changed. The chirping of summer birds had quieted, replaced by the distant caw of crows and the rustle of leaves letting go. The forest floor had turned into a tapestry of amber, crimson, and gold, and each step he took felt like walking through a season of memory. Every falling leaf reminded him of something he'd let go of, an identity, an attachment, an illusion that once felt like truth. He didn't mourn these releases the way he used to. Instead, he began to honor them, as one might honor an elder passing gently into the next world. The things he once clung to were not stolen. They were returned by his own choosing to the soil of his becoming. There was a quiet joy in watching the forest prepare for stillness. Trees didn't resist the shift. They didn't fight to hold on. They let go in beauty, in surrender. And he began to mirror them. He started asking himself, what am I still holding that's ready to fall away? The answers came slowly at first. Old ideas, ancient fears, inherited guilt. But as he sat with those answers, he realized how much energy it took to carry what was no longer his. He had been taught that letting go was weakness, but now he saw it for what it really was: wisdom. The wisdom to make room for something new. He had begun to see that most of what he once called strength was actually survival. The armor, the silence, the endless self-sacrifice. They had all been shields, forged in the fire of necessity. But he was no longer at war, and it made no sense to keep wearing armor in a peaceful village. He began to take it off piece by piece, the mask of certainty, the shield of always being okay, the sword of over-explaining himself. And underneath all of it, he found someone he hadn't met in years, a man who was gentle without apology, strong without performance, and kind to himself in a way that once felt impossible. There were moments now when joy surprised him. Not loud joy, quiet joy, the kind that sneaks in through the cracks and blooms when you're not paying attention. The sound of water boiling on the stove, the way the fire crackled at dusk, the rhythm of his own footsteps on the trail. These weren't events to be celebrated. They were simple, ordinary, but they were honest, and that made them sacred. One morning he woke with a phrase in his mind: "You are allowed to be loved without performing." It stopped him mid-step. He had never considered that love could be unconditional. For years, love had come with expectations, with unspoken rules and careful boundaries. Love meant earning approval. Love meant managing other people's comfort. Love meant shrinking yourself to fit into the idea of what they needed. But now, as he stood barefoot on the earth, he whispered it aloud again, just to feel how it landed. I am allowed to be loved without performing. It didn't feel like a declaration. It felt like a revelation, as if the earth itself had been waiting for him to remember. That day, he wrote it on a stone and placed it by the river, so that others who came might see it, so that they too might pause, might wonder, might heal. He had started writing more frequently again, not for books, not for others, but as a way to anchor himself. His journal had become a sacred witness, a space where he told the truth, even when it trembled. He didn't care about spelling, about style, about eloquence. He cared about honesty, and in those pages, he wrote things he had never said out loud. I miss the version of me who believed anything was possible. I'm still grieving a life I never got to live. Some days I don't recognize myself, and that's okay.